You are listening to the Virginia Press Room
a joint production of the Virginia Public Access Project
and VPM. Now here's the host of the Press Room, Michael Pope.
In the press room this week, we are joined by an all-star panel of journalists from the Virginia Press Corps. First up is the Richmond reporter for VPM News, Kairos Manzanares. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. I'm happy to be here.
We are also joined by the State House reporter for the Virginian Pilot, Kate Seltzer. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rounding out our all-star panel is the State House reporter for Courthouse News, Joe Dodson. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Michael. I'm excited to be here, and that's not just because I recently learned that we get compensated to be here.
All right, let's get right into it with our headlines of the week. Kairos Manzanares of VPM News, you're first with us. What's your headline of the week?
Thanks, Michael. Last week, Richmond Public Schools finally solidified really their stance on immigration enforcement on school grounds. And so Jason Camras had previously told me that, he was ready to stand in front of the schoolhouse doors and protect any student from ICE. But the school board finally passed some not legislation, but some policy to kind of really enforce that. So before this, they didn't have anything in their policy that clearly outlined immigration enforcement. And so they took those steps and also passed a resolution to do so. So now ICE will only be allowed inside schools if they have a judicial warrant.
And what kind of reaction are they getting on that?
They're getting a pretty positive reaction. CASA and ACLU both applauding the district, for taking a stance on this issue, really, and putting policy in place to protect immigrant families. But, I spoke to a woman this week, the only Latina who showed up at the school board meeting, a parent from Mary Munford, who came to really talk about this, and she thought that the policy didn't go far enough. She doesn't want ICE to come into schools at all, even with a judicial warrant.
Yeah, my girlfriend is a teacher up in Hanover County Schools, and she has a student she's really worried about because pretty much the last week he hasn't been in class, and there's just no communication. They have no idea if they are at home, if their parents have gotten in trouble, whatever, they don't know. So it's been very concerning for teachers too.
Do you have a sense of how many students that impacts in the Richmond area?
The district has a large number of multilingual learners. And we do have a large Latino population here, but we also have a large number of Afghan refugees as well. And so, it's a very diverse pool of immigrants, so not just Latino and from Spanish-speaking families. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint the exact number or percentage, but they have said that they haven't seen that many absences in their large immigrant population or schools. However, last week they did have Day Without Immigrants, and they did say that on that specific day, a lot of children did not show up to school. But that was a nationwide protest, so they're saying that was just that one day that they saw a spike in absences.
Kate Seltzer of the Virginian Pilot, what's your headline of the week?
So last week I was writing about free clinics, which have increasingly become kind of this huge makeup of the fabric of the public health system across the Commonwealth, in part because there's a growing number of underinsured people. But the thing people are really worried about is the possibility of Medicaid expansion rollbacks or cuts that could leave hundreds of thousands of Virginians pretty suddenly without health insurance, which could put an increased burden on kind of an already strained system that makes up free clinics. Free clinics are also they're doing a lot more than at one point they used to do. There was a time when they might have done just medical care or dental care, and now most free clinics are doing some combination of lots of different things. So medical, dental care, sometimes substance abuse, sometimes things like speech and hearing care. So we're asking a lot of free clinics. They had a budget ask and they were asking for about an additional $4 million annually. They probably will not get that. Both the Senate and the House versions of the budget come out to about $500,000 for free clinics, which they say is a good step in the right direction, but they worry that it's not enough to continue what they're already doing and also possibly have more people relying on those services if something happens federally.
Are we, I know this is not directly the same issue as what you're talking about, but it's related. Are we expecting a special session later this year to deal with the money that might be involved in the Medicaid rollback?
It's a good question. There was a budget amendment proposed by Senator Deeds and Senator Hashmi that would remove some of the Virginia has what's called trigger language that says if the federal contribution to Medicaid expansion, which as it stands is 90% of that funding. If it drops, then that program is stopped immediately. So that's what the trigger language is. So there was a budget amendment.
And are we expecting that to happen?
I think President Trump has said recently that he loves Medicaid, that he doesn't want to harm Medicaid. It's really tough to predict what exactly will happen. That budget amendment that would have gotten rid of the trigger language did not make it through, but there is a provision in the Senate and House versions of the budget that would require a special session to be convened if Medicaid funding is cut at the federal level.
Joe Dodson of Courthouse News, what's your headline of the week?
So last week, for those who have been paying attention to the General Assembly for a couple sessions, they probably have heard of this bill, but State Senator Jennifer Boysko brought it back up this year, and what it would do is add an affirmative defense for those with neurocognitive disorders, mental illnesses. We're talking about folks with dementia, autism, who assault police officers. And the reason that is needed is because Virginia is one of the only states where it's an automatic Class 6 felony with a minimum of 6 months in prison for those who assault a protected person, so judges, firefighters, and law enforcement. And basically, speaking to advocates, I've heard of a lot of horror stories of adults with autism who are having a sensory overload and maybe become combative with their parents or caretaker. They don't know what to do. They call 911, police show up, and pretty much everything that a police officer is trained to do in a situation, in a crisis, is things that could trigger someone who's having a sensory overload. So they're trained to be big. They're trained to command the room and things like that, and it can really result in lashing out happening, which it does. And another thing that's interesting about Virginia compared to other states is just like there's no severity requirement. So assault can be me threatening you with language. Assault can be me touching you on the shoulder, throwing an onion ring at you. It doesn't necessarily, have to fall into what you would consider assault.
Well, it's funny you say that because wasn't there a situation a couple years ago where I thought it was a French fry. I guess it could have been. No, you're right. It was an onion ring. When the onion ring was thrown at an officer and that was charged as an assault.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that was one of the examples I heard about speaking with folks. It's really hard because those with some of these developmental disorders, they really rely on social programs, social benefits, especially as adults. And it can be virtually impossible to get those when you have on your record a felony. So I heard one statistic from Brian Kelmar of, I want to get this right, it's of decriminalized developmental disabilities, that adults with autism already have an 85% unemployment rate. You add in someone with autism and a criminal record, and it's virtually impossible to get a job.
Are you seeing bipartisan support on this effort?
Yeah, that's a great question. So last year, the bill was vetoed by Governor Youngkin after making it through the General Assembly. And his argument was that there's already things in the code that could be used for this. What he's referring to is in 2021, Virginia ended its reign as one of the only states that doesn't have what's called a mens rea defense available, where you at trial say that because of my mental state at the time of the crime, I can't be held, I can't be found that I intended to do the crime. But advocates are telling me that's not what this is, because a lot of times, specifically like someone with autism, like they might intend to do the lashing out, and it's not because they're off their meds or anything like that. It's not because of anything like that. So yeah, it has gotten some more bipartisan support. This session, 2 Republican senators voted for it, Senator Stewart and Senator Bill Stanley. So that's a encouraging sign for sure.
All right, now it's time for some insider info. This is when our top reporters reveal the story behind the story, giving us an inside scoop on Virginia politics. Kate Seltzer of the Virginian Pilot, you're first with us. What's your insider info?
Okay, I want to talk about FOIA fees because I think this is an issue that probably a lot of us have run into as journalists, but it also affects people who are just in the public and want to get public information that they by law have access to. But as we know, that information can come at a cost, and sometimes those costs are really significant. So I did a little anecdotal, very informal survey of what kind of costs people were dealing with. So I saw that there was a case at VMI where the superintendent was charging $315 an hour to review records. Virginia Tech charged $217 for 4 people to produce 4 pages of records. So in Virginia, they can charge, I think the language is fair and reasonable. Is that right? But the deal is that that can mean lots of different things. So there's a bill that's making its way through the legislature. It passed out of the Senate. And that what it would do is standardize that, I want to make sure I get the language right, but it would be to the median hourly rate of an employee working there, or the actual rate of the employee that will have to do that work of going through the records and producing them and redacting as necessary, whichever one of those is less. So that's crossed over to the House now. We'll see what comes of it. I can say the highest FOIA fee I ever saw was actually in undergrad. I went to school here, and we got back like a $7,000 fee, which was not something that as a student newspaper we had funds for. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has had FOIA fees.
Yeah, I'm sure we all have horror stories. Actually, as you were talking, I looked up my personal horror story, which is in Arlington County, where I was they're covering a situation where a chief of police in a neighboring jurisdiction had been arrested for DUI, and so wanted the mugshot, which all the news organizations had the mugshot. However, they charged $24 for the mugshot. They charged all the news organizations $24, and then I was also trying to get like all of the FOIA requests that had been made of Arlington County. They wanted to charge me like $600 just for the request, not the responses to the request, just the request. They wanted to charge me $500. So, yeah, I mean, this is it's easy to come by these kind of horror stories. Kara, I see you nodding your head. I'm sure you've got some horror stories.
I'm nodding because my coworker recently told me a horror story. And they were trying to FOIA book bans in Chesterfield, and they were charged over $2,000. And so, I mean, it's just insane. I wonder what the public comment period looks like. I wonder if we're going to go, or if other journalists are interested in going and, really trying to make some change there for ourselves.
Yeah.
Joe, I'm sure you got a horror story too.
Well, yeah, not necessarily a horror story, but just something that's kind of I heard about recently, and it kind of ties into my insider info, which is going to be about some legislation regarding baboons. But PETA recently told me that they had to do a FOIA request at Eastern Virginia Medical School to find out some information on the baboons that they're considering bringing in for more animal testing. And they said that they had to pay over $1,700 for those records. So I know it's an issue that's not just prevalent with reporters. It's a big thing for folks that are, interested in the doings of government.
Joe Dodson of Courthouse News, what kind of baboons are in your insider info?
Well, not to monkey around, but let's talk about a really cool bill that came out this session. This was a bill from Senator Bill Stanley on the Republican side, and What this would do is it's a first of its kind bill requiring publicly funded animal testing facilities to offer primates they no longer need to accredited sanctuaries. So a couple years ago, folks might have heard about the Beagle breeding facility.
Also a Senator Stanley bill.
Yes, and again, that was stemmed from an investigation done by PETA, and in that year they passed a lot of reform when it came to animal testing, and one of the things they did was requiring cats and dogs to have an opportunity to be adopted after they are done being tested on. So this just opens that up to the baboons that are currently being tested on at Eastern Virginia Medical School. It's the only public funded facility that still tests on non-human primates.
Little insider info: when animal bills are considered in the House and Senate, you frequently hear animal noises in the chamber. This is more in the House than in the Senate. Although I did hear some animal noises in the Senate recently. So Joe Dodson, important question. Have you heard any animal noises on the House floor?
Yeah, I have actually. Especially, I haven't heard this bill go on the House. I've heard it in the Senate. But
Could you recreate the noises?
No, I can't. I actually am a proud VCU anthropology minor, and the only reason I did that was so that I could take primatology classes, and I just don't think that would be something that my non-human primate brothers and sisters would appreciate.
Cultural appropriation.
Monkeying around. KRS Manzanares of EPM News. What's your insider info?
My insider info actually comes from a question that I have. As we kind of think about Trump's promises of this large mass detention and with that incarceration and just his efforts to do that, we think about Virginia's detention centers, and we have two, one in Caroline County and one in Farmville. In the one in Farmville recently kind of had a switch because it was previously able to operate under a contract with the town of Farmville. But the town of Farmville basically faced a lot of pressure from students at Longwood and also from outside activists and lawyers who would come in and, advocate in public meetings to basically end the contract that they had going on. And so they actually did, right? So they ended the contract that they had. But the facility started an LLC and decided to start a contract with the Prince Edward County Board of Supervisors. So they are keeping the center alive through that contract. So I'm interested in knowing really how that works and why that's really allowed to happen. Because the contract originally was with the town. It started in 2008, right? And so if you're contracting with the town and that's what you need to operate the center, and then now you're kind of switching through an LLC, really, how is that deal happening, right? And so looking into that, and also I have a lot of sources who are planning to come, right, again, to a lot of these meetings and applying the same type of pressure that they did to the town and, eventually force them to end the contract. So what happens if that happens again, right? And so if the Board of Supervisors were to feel the pressure of that and choose to end that contract, what does that mean for the people who are detained in that center? So,
what's kind of the scale of that detention center? I mean, I know I'm from Stanton, Virginia, and near us is a jail that employs a lot of folks in the area. So what's the employment like in a small area like Farmville?
Yeah, so I looked, and it's, according to the press release from Prince Edward County, so they hired a third party to basically kind of give them like a rundown of how this would help the county, right? So it's going to give them over 200 jobs and millions in revenue. So, I mean, it's a good deal for them.
Sure.
And also, they're not, aside from that, they're getting a lot of value in property taxes and also sewage. So they are paying a lot in sewage, water fees, and so they're getting a lot of money generated through that.
All right, now it's time for our game show segment, Buy, Sell, or Hold. I'll present a topic, and our panelists will make a choice. Do you want to buy, sell, or hold? Our topic today, the General Assembly dress code. The media guide to the General Assembly says men are required to wear a blazer, a collared shirt, and a tie. And then, of course, there's this. Quote, denim of any kind is not appropriate attire. Joe Dodson of Courthouse News, our fashionista, you're first with this. Buy, sell, or hold on the General Assembly dress code.
I am a huge sell. I'm not trying to get into a beef with the menswear guy on Twitter or anything like that, but I have to speak my truth, which is that as a 25-year-old who spends most of my money on my dog, I don't have a lot of money for my wardrobe, so it's very hard to have a nice outfit every day that is floor ready, so to speak. But I'm fighting an uphill battle because most folks at the GAB are the type of people who wear a suit on vacation, so it's definitely I'm in the minority. I'm just proposing legislation's all about compromise, and I guess my proposal would be, could we have like a casual Friday?
Yeah, I actually have been kicked out of the Senate chamber twice. Once for not wearing a tie. They will kick you out if you're not wearing a tie. And the other was for wearing denim, which they like to call dungarees in the Senate. Karis Manzanares of EPM News, you're next on this. Buy, sell, or hold on the General Assembly dress code.
I'm sad that I can't wear a Canadian tuxedo, but I am going to buy because I love to dress up.
Kate Seltzer of the Virginia Pilot, buy, sell, or hold on this General Assembly dress code.
I'm a lukewarm sell. I think, I don't want to imply that navigating women's fashion is in any way more comfortable or easier than men's fashion. However, I have never known the horrors of having to wear a tie. So if you tell me that it is miserable and you hate to do it, I guess I believe
tell
you.
that.
All right, then I believe you. I believe men. Anyway, so I think I think I would impose a less gendered norm that says something to the effect of don't be schlubby. Journalism, notoriously schlubby profession, especially
Hey, watch it now.
Wow.
for those of us who are not regularly on camera, myself included. So, I would say like a no schlubs, but doesn't have to be a full tie situation.
Okay, now it's time to open up our reporter's notebook. This is what our top journalists tell us what to be on the lookout for this week. Karis Manzanares of EPM News, you're first on this. What's in your reporter's notebook?
In my reporter's notebook is Latino mental health. This goes along, I think, with my topic of this entire podcast episode, but keeping in line with everything that's going on, even after the election, I started really looking into what schools were doing in terms of mental health services that were different and targeted towards Latino students. I found that in Chesterfield, they do have a couple initiatives, and then in Richmond Public Schools, they work with Child Savers, and they have in-school liaisons, therapists, who are bilingual. There's one at Huguenot High School that I interviewed, so look out for that story. Really interesting, her perspective, because she's able to communicate with students in English and in Spanish. So.
I think about, not just the children, but adults too. Like, what are they doing to seek out that kind of need for some help when it comes to mental health right now?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of stigma in our community when it comes to that topic. So part of it is doing that sort of outreach and work as like layer one, right, tier one, and then talking about the services. So a lot of it is like things that community probably already does that they don't really know, is like maybe coping ways to cope with trauma. So part of it is just like being more informed about coping skills, trauma skills, and then really introducing what types of services are available. So,
Kate Seltzer of the Virginian Pilot, what's in your reporter's notebook?
I also picked a theme and stuck to it. I am contemplating Medicaid this week and what potential cuts could look like at the federal level. I've talked to a lot of people who are worried about what could happen if Medicaid expansion in particular is rolled back, but also just a general idea that the people who will be most affected are likely people who require long-term care. One thing I learned is that Medicare will cover, say, if you have broken your arm and you need to go to the hospital, but it won't cover if you require like nursing home care, which gets very expensive very fast. But Medicaid is one of the things that covers. That's one of the services Medicaid covers. So thinking through all of that, that will be kind of a longer story that'll go out this week, just sort of who would be impacted, what the risk is. The advice I've heard from people is, be vigilant, but not to panic. If you're insured under Medicaid, keep that insurance, keep going to the doctor as you normally would. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what will happen, but yeah.
We talked about the potential for a special session on the Medicaid, rolling back the Medicaid expansion. There is a dollar amount that's associated with how much that would cost, and it's a very large dollar amount. And I don't see them coming up with that. Like, I kind of scratch my head, like, what are they going to do in the special session? Because they don't have the money to finance that anyway, right?
It's a great point. I think that is what everybody is feeling. I think the sense is like, if that happens, you must do something to kind of prevent the mass chaos of having lots of people suddenly without health insurance. But I don't know that anybody really knows kind of what next steps are.
Stay tuned and subscribe to the Virginian Pilot. Let me see here. Closing out our podcast for a strong finish, Joe Dodson of Courthouse News. What's in your reporter's notebook?
So another thing about baboons is I'm going to be looking at LPRs this coming week, so license plate readers. I just recently covered a case in the Fourth Circuit about geofence warrants. It's really interesting to hear legislators and judicial people's thoughts on some of these new technologies that police can use for law enforcement. I've spoken with ACLU, Legal Aid Justice Center, and some others who have some real concerns about how these license plate readers could be abused. And on a larger scale, just the kind of Fourth Amendment implications when it comes to unreasonable searches. So in Norfolk, for example, there was a lawsuit not filed on Wednesday, but allowed to move forward on last Wednesday, that is someone saying, these 175 cameras you have all over Norfolk are invading my right to privacy. So it's just a really interesting topic, and it's something that the bill itself that is going on this session is kind of interesting because it adds regulations, which those advocates are totally excited for. They want regulations on this, but it also allows the expansion of these LPRs onto state highways, which they are not so keen on because that would be about 60,000 miles of highway that could now have these license plate readers.
So this is a bill that was discussed last year. I remember being in the Senate chamber when they were debating this, and Senator LaCherice Aird stood up and gave a pretty impassioned speech against this allowing these license plate readers on Virginia highways. And then after she gave that speech, they killed the bill, right? So this year, there's not a Senate version of the bill. It's a House bill. It's already passed the House. It will be under consideration in the Senate. Do you have any sense of what's going to happen when LaCherice Aird stands up and gives her speech again?
It is just really interesting to see who votes against this bill. Just like in the House in particular, you had it's something that Delegate Coiner and Delegate Rasul agreed on, is to vote against this bill. So kind of it's not the most partisan issue, it seems. It seems like it kind of falls more on your personal thoughts on security and the future of law enforcement, really.
This is the press room. We're busy.
All right, that's it for this episode of The Press Room. Hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcasting app. Write a review on Apple Podcasts, and we'll be back next week for the next episode of The Virginia Press Room.